So I'm going to share some things from my heart here today. 1 Samuel 18, verses 1 through 9. I may not read all verse 9, but after David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. And Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. So I think I'm going to stop there with that reading. And so I want you to notice here, it said that Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. Now, we all know who David was the shepherd boy who killed Goliath, right? Jonathan was the son of King Saul, and he and David became very close after David killed Goliath. And the Amplified says it like this. It says, the soul of Jonathan was bonded to the soul of David. The King James says it like this. It says, they were knit together. That word knit in the Greek, it means they were tied together either physically or mentally. They were knit together. Never before had a mere shepherd boy come out of the fields to live with the king and establish a close relationship with the king's son. That just didn't happen. Jonathan was a prince. David was a shepherd boy. The two didn't mix. They didn't hang out together. They didn't do things together. But all of a sudden, that changed, and it says that their hearts, that they were knit together. They were tied together. Now, Saul became jealous of David, and he devised plans to kill him. And Jonathan protected David. He would tell David when his dad was going to kill him and protected him, kept him from getting killed. And it says this about Jonathan. It says that he took off his robe and gave it to David. It says his tunic, which is, I don't know if the robe goes over the tunic or if the tunic goes over the robe. I'm not sure which one is which, but it says it took off his tunic, his sword, his bow, and his belt, and he gave it to David, and that was his way of making and establishing covenant with David. That was his way of saying, everything that I have is yours, and from this day forward, you will never fight another battle alone. I'll always be with you. And so we fast forward several years later, and Jonathan was killed in battle. And when David received the news, he wrote a psalm of mourning. And he said these words. He said, Jonathan, oh Jonathan, your love for me was greater than that of women. Now, that's how close they were. David had 5 wives at the time. It wasn't talking about your love for me. It wasn't any kind of a physical relationship or anything like that. But because their hearts were knit together, they were bonded together. David cried out, and he said, Jonathan, oh Jonathan, your love for me was greater than that of women. That's how close Jonathan and David were. Now, church, listen. Listen to me when I say, everyone needs a buddy.
Amen. Amen.
Everybody needs a buddy. Doesn't matter how old you are or how young you are. We all need a Jonathan or a David. As I was preparing this, my mind went back to when I was about 29 years old, a long time ago. I'm 79 now. I'm 69 now, so how many years ago was that? 29 to 69. Who does the math on that? 40 years ago. I remember when I thought 40 was old. JT, how old are you? You're 40? Oh, okay. Oh.
39 for the second time.
All right. There was a prominent dentist who had a practice in the West Valley in Sun City with all the older people. And he had a penthouse suite in downtown Phoenix. And he made a lot of money. Came from a prominent family. Went to dental school in the University of Iowa. Moved to the Phoenix Valley. Had a business. He got off into witchcraft. He had warlocks and witches working in his office. He also got off into drugs. And he found himself in a drug rehab, receiving counseling and ministry because of a drug problem. And it just so happened that there was a guy in our church that was a counselor at that rehab. And he led Paul. This man's name was Paul Carlson. He led Paul to Jesus. And Paul started coming to our church. And I met him. I was the worship leader there. I met Paul. And Paul and I became friends. And I went with him to his penthouse suite, downtown Phoenix. And he told me, here's where, he said, we had a pentagram on the door here. And we had all kinds of satanic rituals going on in here with the people that worked in my office and that community. Now, if you don't believe in all that stuff, then, I mean, I'm telling you, I've seen it. And some people say, well, you know, there's really no devil. It's just your carnal mind. Well, let me tell you what. When that 16-year-old girl came out of the third row and attacked me, speaking in church, speaking in a demonic voice, and fell on the ground, writhing like a snake, and opened her mouth as wide as her head, telling me she's going to kill me, and hissing like a snake. That wasn't her carnal mind, and it wasn't my carnal mind. You were there. Louie and Charlene, were you there? So, I became very close friends with Dr. Paul Carlson. He drove a brand new Cadillac every year. Every Friday, you know how these doctors and dentists and all these people, they just work till noon, and then most of them go golfing, you know. But he didn't go golfing. Every Friday, he would come and he would pick me up at my house. Now, we lived in a house in West Phoenix where our neighbors, let me just say, they were very, very unfriendly people. And that's a whole different story. And Dr. Paul Carlson will pull up in his Cadillac into our driveway, and it was a woman whose husband had died, and her 3 or 4 sons, who none of which worked, and they all lived on welfare, and they would all be peeking out of their windows or out of their cars that they worked on as Dr. Paul Carlson would pull up in his Cadillac, and then he would take me to lunch every Friday for about 2 years. And then after lunch, we would go to his house because he sold that penthouse suite and bought a nice home in the West Valley. And we would go there and we would share our hearts with each other, and we would read the Word with each other, and we would pray for each other. And I helped disciple Dr. Paul Carlson for 2 years.
Amen.
It was a Jonathan and David. I had never ridden in a Cadillac. And one day he took me. You think about Jonathan and David. Jonathan gave him his robe and all that. He took me to the finest men's store downtown Phoenix, where he bought all of his suits. So this was 40 years ago, and he spent $500 on a new suit for me. I outgrew it. How many can relate? But he just said, I said, where are we going? He said, well, I'm taking you somewhere. And took me to, because I didn't even have a suit. I'd never owned a suit. And he took me in there and bought me, spent all that money. He said, you're going to need a suit. Paul Carlson became an elder in a church. And he's lived for God, and he gave for many years, he gave half of his income to missions. Not 10%, half to missions. A man who came out of addiction and witchcraft.
Yes, sir.
And I just heard last week that he had a bout with cancer, because I hadn't talked to him in over a year. And I called him last night. And he told me about it. He had cancer in his bladder. And they did all these treatments, they had surgery, and they were able to remove it, but there was this one section where cancer was attached to the side of this bladder, and they couldn't get it. And a lady called him and prayed with him and told him to take such and such a nutrient, whatever, and he said 2 days he passed that growth. And now he's had some stem cell. He's 75 years old today, has lived for God. So if I was 29, he was 34 when we met. He was a Jonathan, I was a David, and God knit our hearts together for many, many years before I moved here. Everybody needs a buddy. I see all these guys over here at the Valiant House, and a whole bunch of us. A lot of times we've had people that we thought were buddies. People that we thought would go to hell and back with us, but let us fall, and they're nowhere around. I do funerals of all those who maybe died because of addiction or whatever problems. And I don't see their party friends at the funeral.
Yeah, come on.
So when I say that we need a buddy, right away some people throw up a wall and say, I've been hurt too many times. I've been betrayed. She did this or he did that. And oh, I forgive them. But we put up a wall and we won't let anyone else in. And so we live unhappy, lonely lives as we take the pain of broken relationship and we stuff it down deeper and deeper. And for some people, the pain becomes almost unbearable. So we medicate ourselves with alcohol or drugs, or we smoke more weed or pain pills, or we become workaholics. Isaac's men have never had that problem. Phyllis kind of jumped all over the Isaac's men. Me and Gary had a conversation. She kind of jumped all over the Isaac's men last week. But what we really need is we need a friend. Now, not very many people are like Susie. Susie goes into Walmart and comes out with 4 new best friends. Most of us are not that way. I remember years ago, our church was growing, and we had a men's retreat, and I visited a man who had visited our church, and I invited him to come to our men's retreat. I said, you should come. I said, we're get to know some of our guys, and we're going to have service Friday night and Saturday morning, and then some guys are going to fish. We're taking some boats, a boat, and we're going to, and then some guys are going to go play golf, whatever you want to do, fish or golf or whatever. And he looked at me and he said, I don't want any friends. I said, really? He said, you'd just get hurt. I don't want any friends. Listen, God never intended you and I to walk this Christian life alone. And you say, well, I have my husband or I have my wife. Listen, I believe that in the place of every man, there is a place that can only be filled by another man. And I believe in the place of every woman, there's a place that can only be filled by another woman. And so I deal with these couples when they get married, and she gets mad because he goes golfing or fishing with his buddies, and I tell her he needs to do that. And I tell him she needs to have an evening out with her friends. There needs to be, don't get me in trouble, Deneen. All right, don't get me in trouble. Chris had his head down and Deneen was waving over there. And so, am I telling the truth? Chris, you can sit on the end over here if you want. Anyway, listen. I got a phone call a couple of days ago from a friend that Phyllis and I have known for over 40 years. This person was really struggling, strong in faith, spent 2 hours in the Word every day, journaling, but feeling so alone. And I said, what you need is you need a friend. And I told this person about Jonathan and David, and I prayed for this person. 1 Peter 4:8 says, love each other deeply because love covers a multitude of sin. Now, a person called me one time, and I hadn't seen him in a long time, and Pastor, I've messed up. Can God really forgive me? And I said, well, Bible says that God is love and that love covers a multitude of sin. I said, how much is a multitude? Anybody have any idea how much a multitude is? Sounds like a bunch. When Jesus fed the multitude, it was 4,000 or 5,000 of just the men, the men, not counting the women and children. A multitude is a whole bunch. And so he tells us to love one another deeply. If we love each other deeply, when a brother or a sister falls, what do? We pick them up. Ecclesiastes says, blessed is the one who, when he falls, there's someone to pick him up. But woe be to the one who, when he falls, there is no one to pick him up. I've been fortunate in my life in times when I've fallen flat on my face that I've had people pick me up and love on me. There's a lot of people that haven't had that. They're walking our streets. They're people you work with. Sometimes, even as with believers, we get into a place where life just overwhelms us, because we need to understand that when we get saved, the Spirit of God comes and unites with our spirit, and there's a regeneration that takes place. But the soul is the mind, the will, and the emotions, and that's where our much of our struggle is. If you look at Peter, Jesus looked at the 12 at the Last Supper, and he said, one of you is going to betray me. Well, they all said, no, we're not going to do that. And Peter was emphatic that he would not be the one. And Jesus said, before the rooster crows 3 times, you will have denied him. Well, he not only denied Jesus, he cursed him. He said, I never knew him. He and all the disciples ran and hid. They all ran and hid. And it's because Peter found out that he wasn't quite the man of God that he thought he was. Has that ever happened to any of us? Have we ever said that we would do one thing and then end up doing another? Have we ever made a promise only to break that promise? I've been that person too many times. So we have feelings like we're not good enough. He or she really doesn't love me. How can God forgive me? Nobody really cares. And our shame drives us to a point of despair. Church, this is real simple here this morning, but I think that we need to allow people to get close enough to us to begin to speak into our lives. Because here's the deal. I got my buddy Larry here. Not Gary, we're not buddies. But if I'm struggling with something and Larry comes to me, and all I know is that he wants to just fix me, I won't listen to him. We got a lot of Christians out there, they get all over the internet, and all they want to do is fix people. You know, if you'd stop doing this, you wouldn't be in this situation. As if they didn't know it. So, but if I know Larry loves me, and he comes to me, I'll listen to him. And that's the type of love, when it tells us that we're to love one another, that we're supposed to have. I see these guys from the Valiant House here, and when you guys go finish your program, and you're all going to finish, I declare that over you. All going to finish. When you go back home, find you a buddy that loves Jesus. Let them speak into your life. And then you speak into their life. Because every time I used to meet with Dr. Paul Carlson, you know what? I was the one that had been a Christian for years. And I led worship at a church in 900. And man, I was a youth pastor and preached and did all those things. And he was the newcomer. But you know what happened? We spoke into each other's life. Because he had wisdom I needed. And before we would leave, I didn't just pray for him. He'd lay his hands on me and he would pray for me. We need to do that with in our homes. Phyllis was sick for a week. I just took her and she said, "Would you pray for me?" And I just took her and hugged her and prayed over her. God would touch her. She'd been struggling all week. That night, she slept all night, the first time in a week. And woke up refreshed the next day. We need that. We need it in our homes. We need it in our relationships. So, Father, I thank you for this group. God, I believe that we have a church atmosphere where we love one another. But I think you're even calling us to a new level. You're calling us to a new level. I see Kay loving on people as she feeds. She fed 80 people yesterday. Meal out in front of the church. I see different ones here involved in different areas of ministry and loving on people. I pray, God, you'd teach us to love our families, but let us love one another. Because we're home. We're home in your presence. And we thank you for what you're doing in our hearts and lives. And I pray, just like in my life, how some shackles fell off of me this week. I pray for anybody here. Matter of fact, with every head bowed and every eye closed, if you say, just Pastor Drew, would you just pray for me? Because, man, I'm bound up with something right now that I'm struggling with. Would you just pray for me right now? I want you to just raise your hand. I want to pray for you. Anybody else? Yeah. Several hands gone up. Several hands gone up. I declare it over this house. Probably 10 hands went up. And God, sometimes when you tug on our hearts, you never come to expose us. You never come to wound us. You never come to beat us up. You always come to heal us and to restore us. And so I pray that your love and your restoring power would break every shackle off of every person. If there's somebody here that doesn't know you, Lord, may we just understand that whosoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. And so we call on you today. We call on you today. And everybody said, Amen. Amen. Yeah.
I received word a long time. His name is Michael Covington from Hugo.
Yeah.
Anyway, would you kind of say a prayer for their family? He was killed in a car wreck this morning and left 2 little babies and a wife.
Father, we pray for this family, the loss. It's been tragic losses that we. Lord, only you, everybody say only you are able